So if you saw any of the materials for today, you probably saw that David Feick was supposed to be here. David's the research director at T-Mobile. We were supposed to co-present. He had to cancel, unfortunately, at the very last minute for personal reasons, but sent his apologies, offered to make himself available to all of you for any follow-up questions you might have about the research that we're presenting today. I actually was able to get him here vicariously, thanks to Staples, so you could at least feel like I had somebody on stage with me, or I could anyway. So I'm John Dick. I'm the founder and the CEO of a little company called Civic Science, maybe otherwise more fondly known by all of you. Who the hell is Civic Science? If you saw the list of us under Nielsen and CBS and ABC. We are having something of a coming out in this conversation today, introducing ourselves and some of the work that we've been able to do with one of our best clients. If David was here today, he would have started by telling you a great story about how the decision-making landscape at T-Mobile has changed dramatically in his time there. There's an increasing onus from his business partners within the company, from the C-suite down to the product team, for much more rapid kinds of insights to drive the decision-making. He would go a little further than that to tell you, which is what he told us, which is, don't just tell me something fast, tell me something I don't know. And tell me something maybe I didn't even think to ask, which is probably the pressure a lot of the researchers in the room here always wrestle with, is how do I find that little nugget of insight that I didn't know to look for? So we have this I know what you're thinking, oh God, another presentation about Gary Busey at AARF. Civic Science is a data mining company. We're based in Pittsburgh. We're there because Carnegie Mellon is in Pittsburgh, and that's where the premier data mining talent in the world is being created. And if you know anything about hacker culture, which is pretty much our entire company, Gary Busey has this sort of cult status among computer hackers. So the guys who've been here to our office before in Pittsburgh have seen that on the girls' bathroom, there's a pink picture of Gary Busey, and on the boys' bathroom, there's a blue picture of Gary Busey. But we mine all of this data, the survey data we collect, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we do it, and we find these little insights about things that you would never think to look for. They seem fairly trite. Often they're proxies, often they're not. This seems like a useless data point, but if you were Kia and you were buying ads on Facebook, what would you do? Maybe you'd target the 23,000 people who are friends of Gary Busey on Facebook. Now it's not quite so trite. More of the data we mine, we find that sometimes we find unanticipated things, sometimes we find things that are complete strong common sense, right? Stereotypes are a super good time saver for those of us in research, right? But we can take it a lot further. The more that we mine the survey data that we've collected, right, this massive database we've begun to build, we can start to do things that are actually really meaningful to researchers. Now, I know you're not listening to me because you're all going to read this. But what David said to us was, in December this past year, their CEO, at a conference for their shareholders at Deutsche Telekom, the parent company of T-Mobile, their CEO announced that their primary objective for 2013 was to steal market share from AT&T. They were going to allow us to come up here and tell you that because it's publicly available information. But what David said is, well, what we would probably do is we'd get a list from one of the major list brokers of all the AT&T subscribers we can find, and we're going to start hitting them with preprint advertising and direct mail, and we're going to start advertising to them and sending them emails and so on. He said, but I know that's extremely inefficient. What can you tell me about the person who's not only an AT&T subscriber, but most likely to switch? And can you find things about that person that are unique or different? To produce this kind of data through a traditional kind of custom sort of survey exercise would have been cost prohibitive. And believe me, the data goes much deeper than this. This was just the most interesting stuff we could pull up. So how did we do that? How do we know? So first I'm going to give you just a tiny bit of background on the technology that we used. So there have been a lot of conversations, even today I've overheard, about the problem of non-response in survey research and how do we all address it, right? So the current sort of prevailing themes about it are either we pay people to take surveys, so that's the panel model, or you could force them, like Google does, sort of force them to take a survey in order to access some content. Our theory was, well, they're already answering polls all over the internet for fun. They do it every time they read ESPN or CNN or their local newspaper. How do we just harvest all that data? They're doing it because it's engaging, which is why the web publishers put these polls in prime real estate. So we went out and we did, over the last 4 years, a number of created interesting relationships with large media companies who own lots of digital and mobile assets that had polls in them. And we did a lot of research at Carnegie Mellon to determine what kinds of questions were most engaging to a given user when they encountered a website. And we instituted all these best practices And so now all these publishers allow us to effectively control the experience of the polls. And inside those polls, we deliver this massive 15,000 plus question survey that I'm going to show you a little bit later. Those responses are appended to a cookie, so we're building this indexed, very massive catalog of cookie-based panelists, as it were. But they're not professional panelists, right? They're just people who encounter a fun, simple poll as they travel around the web. Ross McGowan, who's our head data scientist who's here, likes to say that every time you add a question to a survey, you increase the level of bias in the people who will complete it, and that's true. So what we found is these really short, engaging polls delivered to people inside of content that's germane to something they're interested in allowed us to not only reach lots and lots of people, but to reach non-traditional survey takers. So for the past year, we've worked with T-Mobile. We'll get into the teeth of really what they've been doing. One of the things we're able to do across this vast network, we've meticulously constructed the network of sites we work with to be as demographically distributed and representative as possible, so we can go do deals with Hispanic-speaking websites to reach Hispanics and so on. In the last year, T-Mobile ran a total of 95 custom survey projects delivering questions across this system of respondents that we have. Some of them very ad hoc, one-day turnaround kinds of things. 7 of them are trackers that run through our system every single day all over the internet, and they're able to take daily measures of those things. And they've collected about 188,000 respondents in that time frame. Now, what that's layered on top of is this massive sort of syndicated survey that we filter all over the web, which includes a lot of things in it, but particularly in the mobile category, we could track all of the competitive brands. So we had tracked T-Mobile even before we began working with them. Lots of other mobile usage, smartphone usage kinds of segmentation questions. And again, these are just attributes being tagged to a cookie in a very large database of respondents we've created. And in just of those segmentation questions alone, we've got about 2.6 million mobile panelists. Now, layered on top of that, in the 4.5 years, or really about the 30 months that we've been running this platform, we've asked a little over 15,000 different questions. Hundreds of brands, movies, TV shows, and so on and so on. Political issues, personality type, cognitive process questions that just might show up when you're on PerezHilton.com or the New York Daily News. It seems innocuous, we're tagging it to a cookie, right? So we've got 17 million what we would call active panelists now with a cookie profile developed. Those people have answered about 250 million active questions that we can play around in, and about 2+ terabytes of active live data, which is a lot of data. What our data looks like, if you think about it, though, you're used to a survey where you've got your 1,000 respondents and your 15 questions, and you get your CSV file back, and every cell in that spreadsheet is complete. Our data looks nothing like that. What we've got are tens of millions of people, basically, or 17 millions of people who've answered 15,000 different questions in literally infinite possible combinations. And so in some respects, that data is very sparse. In other respects, it allows us to do some really exciting research. Because what we find is we don't need everybody to answer every question. We just need a large enough subset of the population to answer combinations of questions to make a reliable measure of them. So the objective that David set out to achieve was to identify the likely AT&T switcher, right? We could start with some very simple presumptions, but not only were we going to identify them, how are they different? What's unique about them compared to, say, other AT&T subscribers or other mobile users in general, and what can we do to persuade them? So the very first thing we did is we took one of the questions percolating all over the internet is, who's your wireless carrier, right? We've got about a 1.7 million person sample on that question. Another one is, if you can read it, is how likely are you to change mobile carriers in the next 90 days? We do this for mobile. How likely are you to change banks, insurance providers, buy a new car? Pretty much any kind of frequently changed behavioral thing we can try to anticipate. Well, you cross-tab those two questions, right? The people that we found, now not all of them did, right? So we've got 1.7 million people who answered about their mobile carrier and probably 130,000 or so who had answered about switching during the research phase. So we run those two things against each other and found about 80,000 people who had answered both, right? Among those, we found 2,497 people who said they were likely to switch from AT&T in the next 90 days, right? Nice enough, large enough sample to do some meaningful analysis. From a percentage standpoint, we also saw who were the T-Mobile subscribers that were likely to switch, which was also very interesting, but David would not want me to talk about that. And of course, every other carrier, but this entire exercise was about the AT&T subscriber. So what we did is we took that group of people. If you remember back a few slides, all those big numbers we showed about all the different questions we could cross-tab it against. And these machines we've developed, which are, I mean, trust me, the folks who've been to our office know there's about 10 of us. It's being done by a series of algorithms in a database that we've built that takes that one question and processes it against these 15,000 plus other attributes. So we took the AT&T switcher and the AT&T non-switcher, and we kind of ran them against each other. And we said, what are the characteristics of this group that are different from that one? And what we found is there were some categories. First of all, there was remarkable clarity between the two groups. Imagine if, for those of you who are stats geeks out there, you'll notice the p-value. So essentially what we're doing is we're taking that question and we're cross-tabbing it against 15,000 other things. We're sorting them based on the chi-square test, and then we actually rank order them using a Chuprob's T coefficient, if you're familiar with that, right? Enough stats geeks stuff. What we found was that there were some really interesting dynamics about the likely AT&T switcher that were gold to T-Mobile. First, they were people who were in somewhat dire financial straits. Maybe dire is a little bit of hyperbole, but less than optimal. However, they were people who were very optimistic about their personal finances. So they're in this situation, they don't like AT&T so much, but they think things are looking up, so now's the time to leap, and I'm gonna move into maybe a new plan, get a new phone. Unfortunately, probably, well, unless you're in the credit card business, they were probably gonna use a credit card to do it. But we found this first sort of segment of data that surfaced that really differentiated the likely switcher from the non-switcher on an economic sentiment basis. The second category of things we found, and again, without showing you all of the questions that it was mined against, were attitudes and behaviors around their shopping and buying drivers. The single most correlated question to how likely are you to switch from AT&T was, do you tend to try new products before your friends do? It's probably the simplest way we could tag somebody on the internet as being an early adopter, is simply asking that question. The presumption is that that early adopter was in AT&T because that was the first place they could get an iPhone, and they really wanted an iPhone, so that was the first place they went. And now everyone offers an iPhone, including T-Mobile as of December, and now they can finally break free of the shackles of AT&T, and they have other options. First conclusion we could reach. The other really interesting is normally when we peg these people as value shoppers or brand-conscious shoppers, you're generally one or the other. This consumer, when it came to general shopping and apparel shopping, very, very brand conscious. When it came to electronics, they were cost conscious. You don't often see a split like that. So we were able to learn that this likely switcher, and again, these are comparisons against the people who aren't switching. So as we dug into more about their shopping and buying habits, what we found, we ran about 300 different consumer brands in a couple specific categories, retail, apparel, and the like. There were 301 we tested. Consistent with the last slide, which was their brand preferences, or their brand consciousness, on over 2/3 of all of the brands that we tested, the switcher had a much more positive opinion of every brand than the non-switcher. They just love brands, right? That was just sort of part of their DNA. And so we have several hundred brands. We picked these 300. We ran them all against the sample and rank ordered them, sort of what were the most popular brands among the switcher. And they weren't luxury brands. So these weren't sort of stigma brands per se or elite kinds of brands. They're comfort brands. They're value brands, right? So, but there was definitely a strong affinity for a type of brand. I mean, you have to get down to Target or Whole Foods before you'd probably see a brand you would consider even sort of above the fold. We did the same thing with popular restaurant brands, and I'll explain to you why we did this, and it'll all make sense in a second. Same thing. 2/3 of the restaurant brands and food brands that we tracked, the switchers had a much stronger opinion of that brand than the non-switchers. And again, I mean, it's hard to necessarily say that Outback and Panera are luxury dining destinations, but among that list, they're probably, above the fold, right? So very interesting conclusions we were able to reach about what was driving these people's purchasing and switching decisions. Lastly, we looked at the celebrities because we have it all. We tracked, a few hundred celebrities, and we ran 140 of them and looked at the types of celebrities that they tended to like. Again, fairly similar. It's not the celebrity du jour, These are sort of mainstay celebrities that have been in the public consciousness for a long time. It just was getting a little deeper into what was driving the decision-making process of the switcher. So now, we've identified these people out in the web, we know who the likely switcher is, and we know who looks like a likely switcher. So now the really exciting thing is retargeting all of those people with questions. So the nice thing about the way we've assembled this cookie database is when we encounter somebody on the internet, we know lots and lots about them. All observed, nothing inferred, it's all simply poll questions that they've answered over time. And when David said, I want to ask 1,000 likely AT&T switchers who fit this particular profile the following question, we loaded into that engine, and the only people that ever see it on the internet is somebody who fit that profile, who we'd previously identified as such. So they could land on the New York Daily News and see it, they could land on Perez Hilton and see it, they could be on Kiplinger, they could be on the USA Today, they could be anywhere. And if we had previously identified them as a likely AT&T switcher who fit the right profile, pop-up came certain questions that we asked them. Now that end user probably assumes, in most cases, they're seeing the same poll question on the New York Daily News that everybody else is seeing. And in likelihood, there's about in that case, nobody else but them is seeing that question. In general, there's a 1 in 15,000 chance that if you sat at the same machine, or sat at the same table and went to the same website, that you would see the same poll questions. And so what we did in that test is we ran 6 total promotional concepts targeted very specifically at that subgroup. We knew that there were really 2 categories of likely switchers. There was the brand conscious, which was the second group we showed, and then there was the value conscious, which was the first group, the sort of economic sentiment group. So there were 6 questions that we asked, which was essentially how likely would you be to switch your wireless carrier if you were offered a plan that did X? And X would be allow you to earn rewards for your favorite brands, or earn points to purchase wireless products, right? We found 1,000 people per question, ran the question across them, and it produced a very clear score of which of the top 2 and which of the bottom 4 were going to be the most persuadable offers to target at specific AT&T subscribers who looked like that first slide we showed you. Now, unfortunately, I can't tell you which ones it was. And even if David was here, he made it very clear that he couldn't and wouldn't. What I can tell you is on March 26th, T-Mobile is going to be announcing a very major rebranding initiative, and you will be able to figure out very quickly which one of these promotions came out at the top. So concluding, and if he was here, this is what David would say, right, David? They entered with a certain hypothesis that there was something about the person most likely to leave AT&T that was different from everybody else who was at AT&T, and that we could find a level of granularity in understanding those people to significantly refine the way that they marketed to those people. And we did. Almost surprised all of us how many things correlated to the likelihood of somebody being an AT&T subscriber and being likely to switch. We often do these kinds of things. I mentioned how are you likely to switch insurers or banks or what have you. There's never as much clarity as we found among the audience of people who are likely to leave AT&T. And we've been able, now in a year and a half of working with T-Mobile, to really integrate this kind of thinking and kind of research into the culture of T-Mobile. And again, I'm speaking for him, but there's 30 or 40 people in their business with a software license access into all of these tools. And this is all done inside of software, which I wasn't going to demo for all of you. And it's been very exciting to watch the returns that they've been able to see, the yields they've been able to see by super hyper understanding the target they're trying to persuade. Now moving forward, what's exciting for us and for T-Mobile is that we are going to continue tracking these people. Right? We've identified those likely switchers. We know who they are when we see them on the web. We don't know them down at the personal level, but we know that this particular cookie belongs to somebody who told us 30 days ago they were going to switch AT&T. We can retarget them with questions. We can continue to look at the changing dynamics of that sort of crosstab of who's your mobile carrier and how likely are you to switch to see if there are any changing patterns. Does the profile of the likely AT&T switcher change? Maybe as the economy shifts, right? Maybe they become less value conscious or more coupon driven, for example. And it's also going to be a really effective way for David and his team to measure the effectiveness of the campaign they're running, because presumably we're going to see a lot of those likely switchers move to T-Mobile, and we'll be able to measure and monitor that. So because we're probably new to most of all of you, and there's a lot of new technique going on here, I wanted to err on the side of a slightly shorter canned presentation, spend some time answering questions. If you don't have any, I have other things I can talk about relative to T-Mobile, but I wanted to err on the side of a dialogue if we could. So I'm assuming somebody's walking around with a microphone if there's some questions out there. Here's one.
From the attributes of the likely switchers, it looked to me like some of those things didn't go together. It looked like there were probably some distinct segments within that group. Was that true, or were those just good independent predictors of switching?
Well, there were a few of those that we found that were, I don't remember off the top of my head, Ross, but there were a few that seemed counterintuitive, right? You know, when you're running when you're running like a chi-square test like that, the machine's not discerning which field matches up with which field. So it's just sort of maybe these two things are related. And there were lots of subset segments of people within even the brand consciousness, right? You did have the Carhartt brand, for example, is going to be geared more toward the male switcher, right? Whereas maybe Panera is going to be more geared toward the female switcher. So yeah, there were a lot of. It was a little more complex, obviously, than we can present in a few PowerPoint slides, but yes, that's a great observation.
With all the different categories that we created in terms of switchers, some high indices, how do you know, in terms of the base that you're working off of, if it's worth it for you to go after those particular people that have that particular attribute? And do you factor in the efficiency of then trying to reach those if they're small pockets or large pockets of people?
That's a better question for David if he was here. We're not on that side of the table, but I'll do my best. So what I've been able to gather from their team and the way they've been using it is they are doing some rankings, at least in their head, of, well, certainly we start with the basic demographics, which we can divide into some pretty large chunks. You know, you noticed if I went back to that slide, if I can, the picture with I'll get to it. A lot of it was degrees of percent. We like to joke that we're kind of like bookies for marketers, right? It's like, we're not necessarily saying, here's your guaranteed solution, we're going to give you the odds. And sometimes those percentages were only 17, 18% more likely, right? But they were interesting ones, so we put them on the slide. They weren't the ones they were driving their decisions by. You know, we always like to tell people we do work with, you know, if something comes back 51-49, don't bet your business on it, right? If something's 11% more likely, it only matters if it's better than a coin flip if you were otherwise going to flip a coin. So, so my sense is the way that they've applied this and the way they've managed the targeting, they started with the largest groups they could, obviously, for efficiency reasons.
You started with 3 really clearly defined questions, and how important was it to clearly define those questions to yield the insights that you had? And related, how much of the insights came from algorithms or machine learning versus your own personal human experience and expertise?
The first question was, how did we come about the 3 questions? A little bit of trial and error. One of the interesting things about our business is we have these relationships with all these websites, and we don't pay for it. They're running polls there anyway. They let us kind of take over that real estate, and we give them a bunch of useful data about their own audience that they use to sell more profitable ads. It's basically a barter arrangement, so there's no fixed cost in that. So we're going to do like a 1.25 billion page views of that poll I showed you on the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette all over the internet and for free, right? So we can do a lot of experiments. So we can test a couple different question formats to see how the yields are. So we did some of that. With very little risk and cost, although we didn't have to do it much. It was pretty straightforward what we needed to ask. Your second question is that probably 97% of this is done by machines. I'm not a market researcher, nor am I a software engineer. Pretty much our entire team are really hardcore back-end data mining people that also aren't. We have 2 now data scientists who are really presiding over the methodology, the data quality, and those kinds of things, but the actual research and work's being done by machines. And it is machine learning. There's a lot of artificial intelligence embedded into the platform that we built. And I think that's why those machines are actually really good at finding things nobody would really think to look for. right? Because we generally, when we form hypotheses, they're formed from some based in some bias. And so we try to keep as much human bias out of the computation process as we can. Any other questions? There's one.
Just out of curiosity, did you test those final promotion ideas with switchers and non-switchers?
I don't think we did. I think it was just targeted at the switchers. That's, it would actually, yeah. That's a good point. We hadn't, or David hadn't. I guess that wasn't an angle that we were going to take on it. I mean, it was getting, we're up against the clock a little bit, right? They've got a major announcement in 2 weeks, so we did all of this in about a month, give or take. The benefit was having all of that backward-looking data already sitting in the database. You know, one of the major inefficiencies in survey research is the screener, right? Having to kind of go into somebody every time as if it was something of a new engagement and ask them a question to filter them into or out of your sample. Fortunately, in most cases, we don't have to do that. We kind of had a set number of parameters of subscribers. We knew who was likely to switch. As we got better at profiling who they were, that question was efficiently targeted at the people whose cookies we had identified as fitting the necessary profile. So that helps a lot. Yeah.
How closely did the switcher profile make T-Mobile view their core customer?
Let me think of the right way to answer that question. Not perfectly. Not as much as they would have liked. But we're talking about a company that's about to go through a rebranding of sorts. So I think their assumption is that based on the promotions, they're going to be able to overcome that, right? There's, you know, any brand's got a stigma to overcome. T-Mobile's probably traditionally seen as more of a younger brand. And as we saw in the slide, that the likely switcher tended to be something of an older consumer. Maybe not entirely relative to the rest of the AT&T population as much, but definitely older. So not perfectly, but again, that's the brand that their CEO has told the world they believe they have the greatest opportunity to steal from. And so we told them everything that we could about the likely best people they could steal. Sure.
How do you circumvent personally identifiable information concerns, and how do you make sure that, I guess, what would the pitfalls be in terms of making sure you don't violate any sort of laws or regulations?
I love that question. It's like religion for us. So we collect no PII, right? When I started the company 5 years ago, the very first person I hired was a guy named Alessandro Acquisti, who's at Carnegie Mellon, who had made himself famous because he'd written an algorithm that was able to predict people's social security numbers based on their Facebook profile. It is freaky, it is accurate, it's terrifying. 13% of the time, if he knew your age, your gender, the zip code you were born in, he could predict your social security number because they're sequential. My wife works at CMU and was part of the commercial. They actually commercialized and patented this just so nobody else would try to do it. And what Alessandro was steeped in is this school of what's called deductive disclosure. It's that if I know enough rarefied attributes about a given person, I can discern even without any PII who they are. So let's say you run a query in our system and say, I want to find all of the African American females under the age of 18 who belong to the National Rifle Association, right? Maybe there's 2 people that fit that mold. If you've got the NRA's membership list, you could pretty easily figure out who those people are. We prevent that. So not only do we not collect the PII, we have embedded in our database a series of algorithms that prevent the surfacing of any insight where the sample size is too small. It is kind of under lock and key that our CTO has the only really password to, and so no one could even try to do it. There's a big part of the brand we've had to build. You know, we're asking people to voluntarily engage in a poll on the web, right? And there's a lot of folks who just assume that they're being spied on and everything they give is being used against them or what have you. So we've made privacy a big part of our brand, which also puts a target on us too. So we have to be super, super, super careful about safeguarding that identity with the user. We also know that it's good business because when somebody's identity is attached to the opinion they share, it fundamentally changes the opinion that they share. We see that on Facebook, right? Who checks in at Walmart? We don't, right? Nobody does, but everyone goes to Walmart. You don't check in at Walmart because you don't want your friends to know you're at Walmart, right? I mean, that's these kinds of things that people do. You know, you don't take a picture of the mac and cheese and chicken nuggets you made for your kids for dinner. You show them the coq au vin you made for your wife on Saturday, right? But we know nobody does. I mean, there's this aspirational nature. As soon as people, either aspiration or fear of judgment or retribution for an opinion, as soon as that user fears that their identity is exposed, it fundamentally changes the way they share an opinion. And so we take extensive measures to make sure that those things can't happen. I love that question. Anyone else? Probably have time for like maybe one more question. Sure.
Especially with a new client, how do you stay credible and
we do things like this
insights without scaring them off?
Well, you know what? Honestly, we tend to work a lot through other market research companies and ad agencies. Very few of the engagements we have are actually with the end client. We've built a really cool piece of technology that has a lot of really powerful applications, and we're often relying on the credibility that another market research firm has. I mean, I'm not saying something that's out of school. The NPD Group is one of our investors, and Todd Johnson's on our board, right? A lot of them are here today. They're a wonderful partner, right? They're the ones that look at our data and say, here's the applicability and the application and how to interpret and all of those kinds of things. We're not putting ourselves in a position to do that. In the cases where we have a direct engagement with somebody like T-Mobile, it's a little bit of a two-way street. I mean, they have to communicate back with us and tell us what worked. And we're just now entering into that cycle, right? So which of these promotions did they actually perform better or not? So anyway, thank you all so very much. And my apologies again for David. He didn't say a word. But he did offer to any and all of you who would like to learn more about this to please contact him. His contact information, I think, should be in some of the conference materials. And we're going to be here. We will have a white paper on all of this research that we'll make available to you. So please find us, and we'll let you know how to access that. And thank you all very much. I hope to meet a lot of you the rest of the time we're here.
Thanks very much, John.